Welcome to the Data Science Seminar Series from the University of Washington's eScience Institute. As part of the University of Washington, we acknowledge the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. Joining us today is Besmira Nushi, a principal researcher in the Adaptive Systems and Interaction Group in Microsoft Research. Besmira has made practical and scientific contributions over many years on implementing and deploying responsible AI tools for debugging and troubleshooting machine learning systems. Currently, she's leading the research behind several responsible AI tools for debugging machine learning systems, such as the Responsible AI Toolbox, error analysis, and backwards compatibility machine learning. Her team just released 2 new tools in the Responsible AI Toolbox, which she will cover in her talk today, titled Responsible AI Mitigations and Tracker, new open source tools for guiding mitigations in responsible AI. Please use for those of you on Zoom, please use the Q&A box in the bottom of your Zoom window to ask questions, and we will address these at the end of the presentation. With that, I am thrilled to welcome Besmira.
Thanks. It's great to be here, in a data science audience. Basically, like everything we're going to talk about today is guided and also targeted on to a data science audience and machine learning practitioners. So yeah, really thrilled about that. Thanks for the invite, Vani and everyone organizing this. So basically today we're going to touch upon the 2 new releases on tooling, Responsible AI Mitigations and Tracker. And I also try to give a little bit of an overview of what has happened in the past, either with demos or just descriptions. Before we go into the core of this, I also want to thank the whole V team that was part of this project. This is generally a cross collaboration within Microsoft, across Microsoft Research, Ether, which is the ethics committee and engineering at Microsoft, and Azure Machine Learning. One of the main reasons why we collaborate together is because not only because you need a diverse set of perspectives here, but also because many of these topics are so new that they do need the research input, but they also need the the power of engineering and infrastructure, and for all these things to be integrated into the day-to-day data science tools. So with that, this is going to be our agenda for today. I'm going to briefly talk about like the tools, but just so for us to have like a good understanding of them, I'll also try to give a demo on all the 3 tools that I'm going to talk about, and then we can see all these things in action. So the 2 new releases are part of the Responsible AI Toolbox, and this is an open source framework that we have built in the last 3-4 years for operationalizing and accelerating responsible AI. And a little bit of history. The reason why we started with the toolbox initially was because we started creating all the like principles and standards within the company about fairness, transparency, reliability, and privacy. But then when it comes to the day-to-day work of data scientists, these things sometimes are like really difficult to get going, in that if they want to do proper evaluations from a practitioner's point of view or mitigations, then they need to reinvent the wheel for each and every project. And it's very hard to generalize. So just so we would have practitioners to focus on their work and do responsible AI faster, we started working on these tools that can take away this load from them, and they'll just like focus on their work. Now, have we achieved that? Like, I hope partially, but this is always work in progress. The first, more mature release that we had was basically last year on Responsible AI Dashboard. Responsible AI Dashboard is sort of like a one-stop shop for several toolings that has been built during the years on things like error analysis, fairness assessment, interpretability, and data exploration. And initially, when this field, like basically, I remember like the days of 2016, we were sort of, even as a research community, thinking about all these aspects as sort of like siloed, like I write a paper about explainability, you write a paper about fairness, somebody writes a paper about data. But then when you go to day-to-day work, like you need all of this as a data scientist, and you don't want to jump tools from one place to the other to be able to get all these insights. So the dashboard was sort of like our effort to bring some of these pieces together. And then the latest release that was basically just like 3 days ago on Responsible AI Mitigations and Tracker was intended to sort of like fill in the gap on what do I do after I find an issue. Like, how can I mitigate it? How can I compare different, because the story is not always rosy in that, like, you can try mitigation, it may work, it may not work. So you also want to compare and validate that the thing that you did actually does address the problem that you found on the first place. And for the first one on the dashboard, it was intended initially for tabular data, but we're expecting around May to have new functionalities around vision and language, which is going to be super exciting. The last two are currently only on tabular data, and again, we're trying to make progress to sort of like match on vision and language as well. So throughout the talk, you're going to hear me talk about like these two things as themes or like differentiators to the project. The first one is targeted model debugging and improvement, which really what we mean by this is understanding what is wrong, how it is wrong, like how are things failing in the model before taking an action on what to improve next. And this, again, goes a little bit like differently from what we see happening these days in ML on adding more data and compute. Basically, we want to take a little bit of a more careful approach in debugging. And then the second one is the interplay between code, data models, and visualizations. There are many data science tools out there, but one of the things that can become a real differentiator is using, managing, and learning from the interplay of all these elements in data science, in that you need the code to define your model, but you also need to understand the data to see like what can be done next, and visualizations and performance reports to understand where the failures are happening. And there are interesting challenges in bringing all of this together. So with that said, like, what is targeted debugging for machine learning? In an abstract form, these are like the 4 stages that we're envisioning for targeted debugging. The first one is the error identification process, where we sort of discover what are the common patterns of failure, how can we describe them to data scientists, and moving away from all the aggregate scores, like giving one accuracy number to describe the performance of a whole system. That number hides all the intersectional problems that may exist in the data. It hides the failure modes, and it's just like not informative enough to be able to take the next steps on what to improve. The next stage is the diagnosis. So basically going back to either the data or the model to understand what was going wrong initially in the cohort or cluster that you identified as problematic. We'll be talking about cohorts a lot. So basically a cohort, as a formal definition, is just a set of filters that is applied to the data to slice the data in a meaningful way. For example, it could be like people from a certain age living in Eastern Washington. So just like SQL selection queries, if you will, on pandas data frames that slice and dice the data on either sensitive features or other features of interest. And then the next stage, which is mitigation, and this is where Responsible AI Mitigations library comes in, is the stage where the data scientist takes all this information on identification and diagnosis and takes an informed action about what to do next. And finally, tracking, comparing, and validating is something that is covered now in Responsible AI Tracker. And basically what it does is a disaggregated form of model comparison, meaning that we do compare across different metrics and different models, but also across different cohorts in the data. That is because in the past, we have seen several issues with backward incompatibility in machine learning models, in that even though the overall score of the model may improve during the data updates, that does not guarantee that for certain cohorts, the performance will not decrease. And this can happen for many different reasons, like data shifts, noise, you name it. So this process, again, goes a little bit differently than the usual thing that we're seeing today in machine learning. We don't want to just add more data or more compute to the problem. This is certainly good for just like bootstrapping initial models. But if you want to take a more precision sort of like medicines, so to say, for improving certain issues, then we need to be a little bit more careful and mindful to what errors we want to tackle. Again, during the talk, I invite you to sort of like pay attention to the interaction between all these elements in the tooling. And maybe we can also have a discussion later about like what other forms of interaction between all these elements can be imagined in the future to improve the basically the amount of information that we can get from all this. So what is Responsible AI Tracker? Responsible AI Tracker is a JupyterLab extension, which empowered us in a way to build a lot of functionality around putting together code models, visualizations, and data. JupyterLab itself is the next generation of Jupyter notebooks. And the difference here is that it allows you to work with more than one notebook at the same time to encourage clean data science practices, in that you can separate the code and basically like a very simplified form of an IDE. But it also allows modularity, meaning that you can come in and build up your own functionality. And then the third advantage that we saw initially on this is that not only you can look at code, but you can create React components, visualizations that are built in just as a web page within the tabs. And there we saw the opportunity to sort of build more visualizations in those parts. What Tracker does is that it tracks the models, it maps the data with the code. And this is just a screenshot, but we're going to look at the code later and in the demo. It allows you to list the set of notebooks that you are working with. You can map a model to each of the notebooks to sort of like remember what code was used to generate that model. Which is something that, you know, many of the infrastructure like cloud compute providers today are trying, like that information is there, but it is like very hard to dig up. Like, you know, you have to go really back to get the code. And then the rest, basically the visualization brings together the models, the metrics, and the different cohorts that we would like to evaluate on. And it shows both performance improvements and performance declines, which are just as informative to model selection prior to deployment. So this is Tracker, and we're going to get back to it in a bit. A Responsible AI Mitigations library instead is a Python library that contains a set of mitigation steps and also techniques to target the mitigations to particular cohorts. Both of these are available on PyPy today and can be installed. A few different things that we are doing here is, first, we are trying to envision these mitigations so that they focus on the data quality as it relates to the quality of machine learning models. Now, you may have heard a lot of work, you know, around like we build data sheets or model cards to characterize like how the data is doing, how the model is doing. But these things, like obviously they are like very much connected to each other. So we would like to improve the data in a way that it does improve the model. It follows a very simple interface for applying mitigation pipelines. So basically, we just follow the scikit-learn framework with using like fit transform, and these things can be composed with each other. The function calls are adapted for responsible AI so that we can target particular cohorts. In that, if there are different reasons to why a cohort fails, that are like different from another type of failure. We can customize all that and, for example, do data rebalancing on one cohort and maybe denoising on another cohort. And while like I can say this with one sentence, when it comes to implementing that in practice, I have to slice the data, divide it, and then clean it up or do whatever I want to do, bring it back together, make sure that I'm not like, you know, messing up the merging, remember the IDs, and then retrain the model. So basically, this is the facilitation that is happening behind the APIs. And it's also possible to create different models for different cohorts. This is research that has been done in the past for sort of like decoupling the classifiers. In that it was done in the MSR Cambridge lab. Basically what they propose is that sometimes it is worth altogether to train a separate model in a boosting approach for certain cohorts that may have different specifics than others. So in a nutshell, these are the functionalities that are now available, starting from just like encoding, feature selection, imputing, sampling, scaling, and we're working further on doing more on error detection. And sampling here also contains some data synthesis or functions. And many of these, I have to say, they do build upon like what has been available in sklearn or in other open source libraries, but they're brought together so that they follow the same interface and they also can be used from the same hub, so to say. The functionality on dispatching different mitigations to different cohorts on targeted mitigations is all available in the cohort module that defines the pipelines. And then the third model is more on like diagnostics, basically computing scores on data balancing. And then we want to do more on this, on adding more diagnostics functionalities here, such as like how many missing values are there, how many errors do we find, and things of the such. This is just like a quick figure here about how the workflow would look like. Like imagine you have a set of data, and then in usual ways, like you can apply different pipelines that can be configured in different ways. But in all these cases, we are sort of applying the same operation to the whole data. Now, if we find out, for example, that there is like a larger issue around the cohort, for example, in this one, you can see that cohort 0 is sort of like balanced in terms of the label. If we think like one color is one label, the other color is another label, but cohort 1, not so much, right? And then maybe you would like to do like more rebalancing on cohort 1, and then do just like the standard stuff on cohort 0. And this one would ensure that basically here we apply a more targeted approach for this one. Okay, so with that said, like this is sort of like the overview. I'll move to the demo just so we make this in more concrete terms on what is happening. This is the extension on Responsible AI Tracker, and is available on PyPy. Here we have a list of notebooks that we have built just for this purpose. So let's look at this. And so this is the baseline, basically, that we want to consider. And in the baseline, what we are doing is just applying a very, and I'm trying to, right, people can see this on screen too. So that's great. We are just applying a simple impute and encode function. That is just a standard pipeline that is very common to everybody. Now, the thing is, I can do some sort of evaluation by just using the usual metrics. But if I want to understand where things are failing, then I need to do a little bit more. So basically, what I'm doing here is that I'm calling the Responsible AI dashboard from the RAI widgets package, and I'm adding different components to it. So basically, I'm saying that I would like to do error analysis and also add an explainability component to understand what is going on. And this is going to spin off the dashboard in a different tab. And here, let's see what is going on. The first component is error analysis. And this is something that we had built in the past as a separate tool, and until we realized that these things have to be together. So what this is telling us is that the overall error for the model is 21%. And when we move to this red shadowed parts of the tree, we see that for people who are basically like married in this case, like the relationship is either husband or wife, the error rate increases up to 40%. And for other people, the error rate is only 6%. So this is like the not married cohort. So this means that there is like a high, basically like a 30% difference between these two cohorts. And maybe it is an indicator that we should be maybe like for banks for the buck, this would be the place that maybe we could improve the model the most. Let's look at like what else is available here. Another thing that we notice is that when we look at the precision and recall scores for each of these cohorts, we see that the model has good precision, meaning that probably it is missing out on some of the cases where the income is is higher than 50K. So by the way, all this, like this, I should have mentioned earlier, all this is based around like the census income data set. The task there is to predict income based on features like what we have here, like gender, capital gain, profession, and all that. And all the tools, by the way, all these files that I'm going to present here are available in the open source repository on Tracker and can just like simply be imported by there. So we're seeing that, you know, like the balance between precision and recall is not great. So maybe that is something to be addressed. And then the other component is on data exploration. So basically, I can go in here and I can look at how the data is distributed for particular cohorts or for the overall data. And I can see that here I have some data imbalance. Mainly, there are more examples on the less than 50K income for this data set. But then if I chop down imbalance on different cohorts, we'll see that for the married cohort, which is the one that basically had more errors, the data is more balanced. And this is very different from the prior that the model gives us and could be perhaps like the culprit of the issue here. And if I go to the non-married cohort, the prior looks more similar to the old data. And basically here, if the model just says 0 all the time, the likelihood is that it's going to be correct. So for married folks, this problem seems to be a little bit more difficult. What else is available here? The next one is based on interpretability. This is black box interpretability, but you can also, you know, plug in model-based interpretability methods. And this is just telling us like what is basically the set of methods or like features that are more useful to the model. And we're seeing marital status, which is now like given like the error analysis results, this is probably not like as surprising anymore. Occupation is important, and then capital gain. Now, you could think like, you know, is capital gain a right thing to use here? Like the causality is sort of like on the other side in that you have a good capital gain because maybe you have good income. So this is one of those things that, you know, you could take information from and say that I don't want to use it because it is not causal. It may, however, drop the model performance because many of these spurious correlations, like they are actually predictive and they can be useful to the model, but it's not something that you can really observe in the real world. Okay, so to summarize what we found here, we found that there is a discrepancy between married and not married cohort. And we also diagnosed that for the married cohorts, the imbalance is very different than for the not married one. So taking this information in consideration, basically what we're going to try to do is to balance the data in different ways using the mitigations library. So here we have yet another notebook that it's the same as the previous notebook, but what this one is doing right now is to rebalance the data in a way that we have a single, you know, the same number of samples on the positive side and the negative side. And we are just using SMOTE on the background for this, which is a known technique. And let's see what happens to the data after we apply this mitigation. So this is, again, one of those things that we call like a blanket mitigation, just rebalancing more data for everybody without taking in consideration the cohorts. So this is how the data looks like after we mitigate. And we see that the full data frame is perfectly balanced. But when we go to the cohorts, we see that for the Married cohort, this has flipped now. Like we have, because it doesn't know about the cohorts, the blanket mitigation is just going to pick things mostly from the Married cohort because that has more positive labels. And then for the not married one, basically things are just like the same. So let's see if we want to compare the models here, how these are doing. So here we see that in overall, and I'm going to just like hide some of these things so that they don't become too crowded. So we see that in overall, the accuracy is improving because of this data balancing. And this is not surprising for us, right? Like we know that like doing more rebalancing is going to help. But let's see how things are going for the married and the not married cohorts. We see that the married cohort, so let's work a little bit on like what is the notation here. So here we're showing in the brackets the difference between the performance of the model from the baseline, which is this one, and the new model, but on that particular cohort. So in this case, we are comparing for married, we are comparing this number with this number. And we're saying that there is like an 8% improvement here, which is great, right? But still we see that there is an indication of discrepancy between these two. And the question is like, can we do better if we apply a more customized approach? So what we are going to try next is a more targeted approach, but that tries to balance the both cohorts separately. Like still they're going to be balanced, but they're going to be separate from each other. So let's see how we can do this by using the Cohort Manager class from the library. So here we're defining the cohorts. Again, this is just a set of filters. We're saying that if it is in one of these relationships, then this is the married cohort. And then with none here, this means that everyone else outside of this cohort, just to take care of like the rest of the data. And then we're creating two pipelines. And these are both rebalancing pipelines, but these pipelines are now custom for each of the cohorts. And then the Cohort Manager basically does the mapping. We're saying that the set of pipelines is going to be these two. And this pipeline is going to be applied to the married cohort, and this pipeline is going to be applied to the not married cohort. And then under the hood, all the sampling process is going to be isolated. And you don't have to take care of this. Like the Cohort Manager is going to do that, whether it is rebalancing, whether it's scaling, because sometimes with scaling, you know, the parameters matter. Like, do you want to scale with the min max of the whole data or the min max of that particular data? And then let's see how the data looks like. So basically we're just like calling fit resample here on the Cohort Manager, and then applying the usual sklearn pipeline. So this is it. Like this is the number of lines of code that you need to do to do this rebalancing. And let's see how the data looks like. So the full data frame is balanced, and so are the two separate cohorts. And that is, and we know for sure that all the data that has been resampled from the positive class is going to come from each of these cohorts in the original data. Now, the thing here, and this is like the hint that I wanted to give, is that whether this may be fine for, you know, for the married cohort, this is actually changing the prior on the not married one. So it is not clear whether this is a good thing to do for this cohort, but let's see what's happened. And So this is what we're going to do. And then we see that if we focus on this one, so basically this like last 3 rows, we see that the overall model performance is sort of like the same. Things have improved for the married cohort, which was a problem, the one that had more problems initially, but we have dropped the performance in the not married cohort, which is basically what is happening after changing the prior on this one. And again, it's one of the situations with like severe backward incompatibility issues in that it's the same accuracy. If I show this on Kaggle or on any other framework, it's going to say this model is as good as the previous one. But if we think about like the trust issues with the human, this one is going to introduce new errors and is perhaps going to break the trust with whoever was using it in the past. And then the last mitigation that we are going to see is basically, again, rebalancing, but we are not going to touch basically the pipeline is empty here. For the not married cohort, we're just going to leave it as is and rebalance the data from there. And as you can see here, the full data frame is not as balanced as what we saw before. It is balanced for the married cohort, to reach that parity, and the not married cohort is the same as it was. And we can see, like, if we add this again to the picture and focus only on this one, we can see that in overall, we do have improved more than the previous things that we saw so far. And as well, we have improved more on the married cohort, which was the problematic one, without, harming performance in the not married cohort. So basically, this is like the value of paying attention to what was going wrong and the diagnosis behind that. We hope that with the tooling, things become a little bit easier. I do realize that it is still like more work than just like not looking at any of these numbers. But again, if we want to improve things like in a responsible way and make sure that the quality of service is good for all groups, it's sort of like a work that we'll need to do. So this concludes the demo. I'll just say a few more words of where are we heading next, and then we can open it up for questions. So again, here we took advantage of all these elements to show them within the same set of tools. But what we would like to do in the future is to sort of like learn and improve from this whole process of diagnosing and mitigating. So the question is, if we have a set of many tabular data, because this is so far only non-tabular data. And if we adapt some of the AutoML approaches so that they can take into account this cohort-based performance and mitigation. And if we can also learn from all these data sets such that they're able to create an assistant that can suggest mitigation pipelines for you, like not really automating the whole process, but having the data scientists in the loop to evaluate 3 or 4 recommendations about what mitigation steps can be most useful for a particular issue. So what is like the differentiator here? Because we've seen like Copilot, we have seen AutoML approaches so far. The difference here is that if you just do code generation, you will not look at the data. So the data is like out of the picture. So you need to look at the data to identify some of these issues. The other thing is that generally, both the meta-learning and the AutoML approaches do not generate diagnostics about what went wrong. And that is a missed opportunity, right? Like, because if you know what was wrong, then you know what you can do. Like it's almost like a heuristic approach in a way. You don't even have to do much learning after that. So bringing that diagnostics into the picture, we hope that is going to improve some of this, and really like envision this a little bit more like as an assistant that can suggest 3 or 4 things to you, and then and see what happens after that. So with that, thanks again, and open for questions. Sure, yeah.
Can you, and maybe this was included in here, can you imagine a way to do the cohort discovery? That is to look through the facets and discover which cohorts are underperforming relative to others?
Yeah. So basically, and I should have gone a little bit more depth in that part. Yeah, so that is basically what happened in the first part.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're doing this, like this is being automatically discovered. We're just training a very simple tree to differentiate between the cases where the model is wrong and those where it is correct. And it's finding out that the leading factor here is basically like the relationship. And so this is sort of like the optimal way of slicing the data to say that in a way that there are more errors on one side. And it's very simple, right? Like it is just like a simple decision tree to separate the data.
And I see that how this connects into the future work for you, which is now that the cohorts have been identified, it can generate a skeleton of potential pipeline.
Yeah.
Very cool.
And thanks.
On this point, like I wonder, I think in this case it's like just categories.
Yeah.
It's pretty, easy to decide what cohorts are because the data, maybe people have already know what they're looking for. But what if it's like some sort of like flow data that it's really not, it's just features, and they're not really, have tons of millions of features. Is there some way to, even if you do this tree, most probably you're gonna split into million pieces.
Yeah.
Is there some way to find some templates that tell you that the ones that are looking like that are underperforming?
Yeah. It's still on tabular data. Is your question still related?
Yeah, but I'm thinking the case when it's a lot of features. And
yeah.
Now this is this example.
Nice. Yeah. So for one thing that can be useful is we're doing this for language and vision is extracting metadata about the data. For example, you could think about like pixels as being like many features, but what we're doing behind the scenes is just like to extract things like blurriness or like how dark is the image or the bounding boxes, how big they are, because they are usually leading factors. But for tabular data in particular, I think what's worth trying, and we don't have this like with the current tooling, is to do some clustering of the features themselves to measure the correlation between them. So to have like a correlation analysis between the features and see if there are like, for example, a set of 20 features that are related to each other. And then let sort of, because we always need the data scientists in the loop, do this like one-time task where they look at these meta features and they try to label them and say that these are like all these 10 are about this, and then all these other 10 are about another concept. Again, it's like a human in the loop process, but that's what we're here for, I guess.
Yeah, I think having the tools, because people kind of do stuff like that, but you have to plot it, do some sort of but having some tools to facilitate that would be really helpful. It's like going back, looking at it, understanding.
Yeah. Thanks.
Is your validation set remaining the same in that rebalancing demo that you showed? What do you do when you are you discarding data? Are you moving it to validation?
And so we're just like separating it from the start, and then keeping the validation set as is, and then everything else is done on the training data, like every mitigation. And in practice, you could use it to do anything. Like you could use the classes to do it on any data. It's just like for the purpose of experimentation. Yeah.
I was wondering how you define different experiments. I could imagine now you have, like, for each experiment, it seems you have like a new notebook. I feel like I could see cases where I could do like thousands of experiments, and sometimes maybe the scale parameter is just different. Is the notebook the way you version and connect the data and the model, or is there something in the background
It is a notebook, and that's why I also would like to have more feedback about, like from this audience, because this is something that we're like trying to introduce in a soft way, but we also realize that data scientists may also do a lot into like one notebook itself. I guess where we're drawing the separation line right now is that if you just want to do like usual hyperparameter search, this is not exactly, you know, the tool that you should be using. Like you could, right? Like nobody stops you for that. But if it is just that, then just using like the usual model selection techniques is also fine. But it's just like if you're trying to do something more that is changing the way how you deal with the data or the architecture, then you could bring in this kind of things. But like, tell me more, like, what do you think, you know, in terms of like separating this on notebooks?
Well, yeah. I mean,
yeah.
I always try to minimize the notebooks that I use. Actually, most of the time, if I go into more production, I mean, I'm a researcher. I don't do like production paper stuff.
Right.
But when I do that, then I try to merge like a Python file. Yeah. And I don't know if there's one tool I know of. From Iterative AI, DBC and DBC Studio, and they kind of, it's mostly tracked with JSON YAML files and Git in the background, so that I can, even if I, found or did a lot of experiments, but I knew like, oh, my first experiment was actually still the best, that I could go back to this, and I like that approach, but I also like this.
Yeah. And yeah, basically, you know, we're thinking about introducing like Python files into this process and keeping track of that. But then you have to take care of like become a little bit like a Git provider, in that you need to take care of the other code that is connected to that as well. And just because, you know, we're focusing so much on you know, data mitigations, that thing will be reflected in code, and that's why we needed those pieces, really.
Well, I think my case is where you have the exact same code, and two models just came from two versions of the data, right? So as the data is changing, you're getting the data, retraining, exact same code, exact same notebook, it's going to produce different models, and you would like want to plug something in our.
Yeah.
I think the notebook support is really good for like once you're in experimentation phase, right? You're using a lot of notebooks, you're going back and forth. Once you put this in production, it's usually pipelines, right? Automated pipelines, Databricks or MLflow or like some things. And you want to catch this as this, you know, over time, a model starts to drift maybe, once an alarm to go off, right?
Yeah. You know, it related to what you're saying, something that also happens is that some of these things here are run in a completely different framework. For example, like the data cleaning may be happening in a completely different, like Databricks, for example. So we're thinking about like the integration with both MLflow and either Databricks or like Azure Databricks and other data services, so that we can keep track of the provenance, basically, that happened on the data, or like get some, I don't know, YAML file or like a description of what has happened to the data and attach it to the model as a description, right? Like it will not recreate the whole pipeline, but at least there is like a testimony of what happened.
There are some tools like they're doing something similar in this to this. One comes to mind is robust intelligence. I don't know if you've heard of that.
A little bit, yeah.
So they do this type of cohort thing, but they also do perturbation, and they're more geared towards kind of the production environment versus implementation. So maybe some ideas to borrow from.
Yes, yeah. And again, model comparison is something that either happens at the experimentation stage or at like the deployment stage in a way.
More of a comment. These are great tools. But I think the data scientist plays a significant role here. I'm wondering, like, if you can comment on the ethics part of, you know, portion of this subjective choosing of how the cohorts are being reshuffled. And sometimes there could be data augmentation, like we talk about remote sensing and
perhaps augment data in some cases? And how is that going to affect the cohort balancing and what's the role of the data scientist in this whole process?
Yeah. So something that we need to be sort of aware of is that like tools bring you a lot of benefits in this space, but there is a lot more that we need to do beyond tooling, like defining the process, in that you can provide all functionalities you want on slicing the data with these tools. But if you do not get that cohort right, like the definition right, then you're going to miss out on a whole set of population groups. I remember like there was this paper about how we define like skin tones, how we did it in the past and how we're doing it now. And basically what the paper was saying is that the spectrum was just like it had like 3 different values. And it was missing out on a whole set of like population groups because it wasn't fine-grained enough. And just because of that, like no tooling is going to tell you that that definition is not good, right? So there is a lot of process that we need to do beforehand to get to the tools, And then about like the data scientist in the loop, like it is true that like our audience is mostly like data scientists, but then the question is like what happens next in the sense of like who looks at this table? And is it only the data scientists, or are they just like going to share this with the decision maker and take a decision from that on which model to deploy? And how is that decision made? And like what are the SLAs or like the constraints? And again, that is something that we need to work a lot of like on simplification on the visualization side, because we do get this comment very often in that if you are not like a data scientist, then you wouldn't probably understand many of the numbers that are in these tables. So I feel like there is like an opportunity to bridge the gap there to sort of transform this report and basically like what we see here and like interpretability scores into a more manageable form of information for decision makers. And again, like we haven't done that yet, but there is an opportunity gap there. Yeah. Thanks.
I'll just recommend that maybe there's gonna be an interesting study to get a whole set of people to experiment with this and see how whatever they picked affects the final scores. Look at the cohorts of the people that are actually doing that, and that's how that affected.
Yeah. Like not on this one, but I've seen some other studies in other related areas in responsible AI, and they're saying that if you do not belong to that particular subgroup, intersectional subgroup, it is very hard to find the issues. Like, so you do need that diverse audience to do the testing because you'll just not see it, right? Yeah.
Online, no questions online, but if you have any, please put them in the Q&A box. I see no questions in the Q&A box, so I'm assuming we can wrap it up here. And thank you very much, Besmira, for your presence here today. And thank you for being present in person to meet Besmira. And that concludes our session today.